welcome to this 6th video in the series, The Bread of Life. One of the wonderful things about the Bible is that it always has something new for us. I've been reading the Bible for over 60 years and I'm still discovering more and more and more. And I think if I had another century to live, which is not going to happen, at least not in this present body, there still wouldn't be enough time to know all that there is to know about this book and what it contains. And that would seem to me to be normal, because the Bible is the Word of God, and because He is God, He is greater than anything we can fathom or even imagine. But in His greatness, there's also His goodness, and He allows us as we move along to discover more and more and more of His Word, His will, His wishes for us. And sometimes when we come back to a passage that we've read perhaps many times before, He shows us things that we had totally forgotten or ignored or simply not noticed up until then. Recently, I read once again the story of Esther in the Bible, and I'm excited about some of the things I've found there and which I want to share with you in this video and in the next one. It's an extraordinary story, and one of the things that makes it so extraordinary is that even though it's a book of the Bible, God is not even mentioned in it. There's 3 important things that you need to know before we start on this story of Esther. First of all, just because God is never mentioned doesn't mean that He's not present. To the contrary, we will see the traces of His work in this story from the beginning to the end. Ever since the day that God specially blessed Abraham, his people, and the promised land, the people of Israel have been subjected to endless jealousies and persecutions. This was the case when they were mistreated as slaves in Egypt and delivered by the power of God through Moses. It was also the case when Israel had to be punished for their unfaithfulness to God and was delivered into exile into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Again and again, the people of Israel would experience unfounded, unjust persecution under the Romans, under the Ottoman Empire, and unfortunately also by supposedly Christian men, culminating in the Holocaust of World War II. And once again, this hatred of Jews showed its horrible face on October 7th, 2023, in the unspeakable massacre in Israel. Often in the history of this people, God has seemed to be very far away. Yet the existence and the miracle of the very subsistence of this people is the very evidence that God had not forgotten them. God never forgets His people or His promises. And in the story of Esther, the God who is so absent that He's not even mentioned in the text, yet once again manifests His presence, His power, His plan. Much is being said in many places today about the reality of anti-Semitism. Many people seemed to somehow believe somewhat naively that with the end of World War II and the crushing of Hitler's Nazi regime, the problem of hatred toward the Jews would be over. But to believe that was to sadly misunderstand where that hatred was coming from and where it is going. You see, it all goes back to the rebellion of Satan against God, the struggle of evil against good. When God called Abraham to pack up and leave the Mesopotamian city of Ur to go to a beautiful place that He had prepared for the patriarch and for his descendants, as the people of His choice through whom He would reveal Himself to the world, Satan was furious. At that point in time, which we can't precisely identify, began the struggle of the Jewish people, simply because they were the people chosen by God through which the world would be drawn to fear him, to know him, and for those who would believe in him and submit to his will to be saved. It was through the people of Israel that the Messiah would come, and it is through the people of Israel that Jesus will return. So let it be clearly known that to hate the Jews is in reality to hate God, our Creator. Anti-Semitism is an expression of the attitude that says to a loving God, I couldn't care less. I only want to live as I please. I'm not interested in your loving kindness, in telling me how I ought to live, and in providing a plan to save my soul for eternity, because I haven't obeyed you and I'm on my way to hell. This hatred against the people of God and against God himself is therefore very present in the world today, and it is nothing new. We find it already in this book of Esther, probably written in the 4th century BC. It is believed that Mordecai himself, one of the key figures in the story, wrote the book of Esther. The story takes place in the city of Susa, capital of the Persian Empire, which stretched all the way from India to Ethiopia, covering 127 provinces, all subject to Persia and its king, Xerxes. Persia was located where Iran is today. At the time, there were no ayatollahs, but the regime of the Persian Empire was also a severe dictatorship. It was not until 1935 that Persia changed its name to Iran. Now, having noted that the absence of any mention of God in this story doesn't mean that God was absent, here's a second thing we need to notice. This story is a wonderful picture of a life principle to note and to remember. Nothing in our lives happens by accident or by chance, at least as long as our lives have been placed in the hands of God. We're going to see a poor immigrant orphan who becomes the queen of a huge empire. It's as astonishing as a fairy tale could be, but it's not for nothing. Third thing that we need to notice, this story will show us the importance of patience. Oh, how difficult it is to know how to wait. Have a look next time you drive by a bus stop where there's people waiting for the bus to come, looking at their watches, sighing, pacing back and forth, chatting with the neighbors, but impatient. Sometimes for preachers, it's difficult to look down into an audience and see that after a few minutes, some people begin to look at their watches. It's difficult to wait, particularly when we're going through difficult situations that seem to be endless. But we need to remember that nothing on earth is permanent. So the story begins with a sordid event in the life of this sovereign. A huge feast sponsored by the king for all the dignitaries of the kingdom was organized in Susa, the ancient capital, the remains of which, by the way, can still be visited today. In his pride, Xerxes wanted to show everyone the splendid wealth of his kingdom and the dazzling magnificence of its greatness, his greatness. Having made the festivities last for 180 days, 6 months, he organized another week-long celebration for the entire population of Susa, rich and poor together. After a week, under the influence of alcohol, he pushes his vanity and pride to the point of sending his servants to fetch his wife, Queen Vashti. He wants to show her off, to show off her beauty to everyone. The only thing we know is that she was supposed to come with her crown on. It doesn't say whether she was to wear anything else, but he wanted the whole city to see the beauty of her body. Except that the queen doesn't see things that way at all and refuses categorically to be shown as a beautiful possession of the king. Xerxes, furious and humiliated by Vashti's disobedience, consults the wise men of the country, his advisors, to know what behavior to adopt. Warning the king against the risk that the disobedience of a wife, and especially one who had a lot of influence like the queen, would create a precedent for other women, the wise men pushed the king to issue a royal ordinance by which Vashti would never again be received into his presence and would be replaced as queen immediately by another who would be better than her. Then the king's commissioners were charged in all the provinces of the empire with searching for all the beautiful young girls of the kingdom in order to bring them to Susa so that Xerxes could choose a new queen. Now there was in Susa a Jew named Mordecai, a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, and who had been deported from Jerusalem under the conquest of the holy city by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Mordecai had raised his first cousin, Esther, orphaned by both parents. Esther's father was therefore Mordecai's uncle. However, Esther, being young and beautiful, was taken, just like all the other beautiful young girls of the kingdom, to the harem, where they would be kept until the king would make his choice. It turns out that Esther really pleased the king's servant, who was responsible for looking after them, and who gave her preferential treatment. Esther was therefore placed in the best apartment of the women's house with 7 young girls, and she received everything she needed for her toiletry and for her subsistence. Esther was careful not to divulge anything about her origins and about her people. Mordecai kept an eye on things and dropped by every day to see how Esther was doing and how she was being treated. One at a time, all these young women were to spend an evening in the king's house, after which they would be welcomed into the residence of his concubines. They never returned to the king again, unless he requested them by name. When leaving the women's house to go to the king, they had the right to take with them whatever they desired. Esther's turn had come. She didn't want to take anything with her when leaving the house, except that which was designated for the young women by the man who was in charge of them. Esther found favor in the eyes of everyone. I can imagine her popularity a little bit like that of Lady Diana or Kate Middleton now. And the king was also seduced. The text tells us she obtained grace and favor before him above all the other young women. And so he chose her as his queen, organizing another big party in her honor. And here we read something that could almost go unnoticed, but which is very important. This is because while being queen of Persia, Esther behaved somehow as if she were still under the tutelage of her cousin Mordecai. She still has not revealed her origin or her people. There's a hint there of how the Jewish people were already being despised. This did not prevent Mordecai from hanging around the king's palace every day. One day, Mordecai will learn about the grumblings of 2 of the eunuchs who were servants of the king and who were plotting and wanted to eliminate Xerxes. Mordecai will inform Esther, who in turn will inform the king on Mordecai's behalf. The thing being verified and found to be correct, the 2 culprits were arrested and hanged. From there, something new comes into the story. Was King Xerxes afraid when he discovered the attack that was being prepared against him? We don't know, but in any case, we learn that he took the decision to put in place a deputy, a bit like a prime minister, who will henceforth be responsible for all of the king's servants. The chosen deputy, Haman, will be obeyed and revered by all by order of the king. The servants who stood at the king's gate were required to bow the knee and prostrate themselves before Haman, which they all did, except for Mordecai. And the others asked him repeatedly, "Why are you disobeying the king's orders?" Mordecai didn't pay any attention to them, simply responding that he was Jewish. So they report him to Haman, who becomes furious, but he does not immediately raise his hands against Mordecai, preferring to invent a plan to destroy the Jewish people everywhere throughout the kingdom of Xerxes. So here is an intention of ethnic cleansing, as they would call it today, and genocide, reminiscent of what Israel's enemies still hope for today. But before proceeding with the execution of his atrocious project, he resorts to a Persian practice to decide by fate when he should act. So fate indicates that the enterprise attempted against the Jews should not be carried out before the 12th month, which is called Adar. He did not realize that this delay would allow the Jews to avert the blow that was threatening them, and would also allow Esther to erase from the mind of Xerxes the bad impressions that he had been given about Israel and the Jews. Haman is going to speak with King Xerxes to mount his accusation against the people of Israel, scattered across the provinces of the kingdom. Now listen to the accusation made by Haman.
Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. And if it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury."
All of that because a Jewish man faithful to what God required of his people refused to bend the knee and bow down to anyone other than God himself. Let that be a reminder to us in passing that sometimes obedience to God can have very serious consequences on our lives, but God does not abandon those who obey him rather than sinful men. Now, how will Xerxes act following this accusation of the Jews? In a catastrophic way at first glance. He takes off his ring and gives it to Haman so that the latter can use it to seal letters to all the provinces demanding the destruction, the death of all Jews, young and old, little children and old men, on the 13th day of the 12th month of the year. All their property was then to be plundered. And in all the cities of the kingdom, including Susa, the capital, the king's edict was to be published. We can assume that the population of Jews in Susa must have been large, since we read that the city was in consternation. Obviously, the entire Jewish population throughout the kingdom of Persia was in shock and desolation. They fasted, they wept, they lamented, and as was their custom, they covered themselves with sackcloth and ashes. And here we return to Esther. What could she do? The text tells us that she was scared, and rightly so. That's quite understandable. She tries to act quickly and sends a servant with clean clothes for Mordecai, who refuses them. So she sent another of the eunuchs that the king had placed at her disposal to consult Mordecai about everything that was happening. Mordecai sends him back to Esther with an explanation of the situation, where the king had accepted that he was going to be paid in exchange for the death of the Jews. He also sends a copy of the king's decree, but then he demands of cousin Esther, who had benefited from his care during her youth at his home, that she go to the king to ask for his pardon and implore his favor over the Jewish people. Now, although Esther was queen, she knew that according to the law, no one had the right to approach the king under any pretext except by invitation from Xerxes himself. And in her fear, this is what she told Mordecai, adding that she had not been called to the king for 30 days. No doubt she also kept in her mind the fate of Vashti, her predecessor as queen, who had dared to disobey. And here we arrive at the ultra-important point in this story, because it can be applied to our lives, to yours and to mine. Listen very carefully to Mordecai's response to Esther.
When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?"
So what's so important about that? This is the question that Mordecai asked. Who knows whether it is not for such a time as this that you have become queen? I don't know where you live today or in what conditions. Oh, I know there are dear brothers and sisters listening to each one of these videos in terribly difficult living conditions in the enormous Nakival camp in Uganda. I know there are others who almost miraculously survive in the current situation in Haiti with the war between the gangs. I know that others in several countries face every day the difficulty of feeding and clothing many orphans under their care. And I know that others in Western countries don't experience any material difficulties, but struggle with serious illnesses or frustrations with incapacity for work or with unemployment. And I know everyone may ask themselves at one point or another, what am I doing here? Why do I have to experience this? You may not have arrived at the throne of royalty like Esther, but just like her, you are afraid and you don't know what to do. My brother, my sister, you do not know why God has allowed you to be where you are, but you know that He asks you to have the courage of Esther and Mordecai by standing firm for what is right and just and true. Moreover, since we know that on earth nothing is definitive, the most difficult circumstances can be changed in the wink of an eye. They will be anyway when our Savior returns. So let us hold on while we're waiting. In our next video, we'll see the continuation of this wonderful story of Esther. In the meantime, remember that if you have ever come to Jesus Christ in a spirit of contrition, confessing your sin and your need for His mercy and forgiveness, and opening your heart to His Holy Spirit, henceforth you don't belong to yourself anymore. And since you belong to God, surrender yourself completely to His will. Faced with your fear of tomorrow, faced with your uncertainty, stand up and accept that where you are, He can accomplish His purposes in you and through you. And who knows, if it's not for a time like this that you arrived where you are today.
My stubborn will at last hath yielded. I would be thine and thine alone. And this the prayer my lips are bringing. Lord, let in me thy will be done. Sweet will of God, still fold me closer till I am wholly lost in thee. Sweet will of God, still fold me closer till I am wholly lost in thee. Shut in with thee, O Lord, forever. My wayward feet no more to roam. What power from thee my soul can sever? The center of God's will